Religions are examples of what philosophers call comprehensive doctrines. This means they provide a very complete outlook about how we should live, both in terms of what's good for us and what's ethical. They have a system of moral rules that provides guidance across all aspects of our lives, from what we eat to how we treat our neighbours. In Australia, there are many religions, each with their own very specific set of moral rules. Now, ideally, we should want a society that can accommodate all this difference, but this hasn't always been achieved. Words like heresy and martyr remind us of times when people got executed and tortured because religious intolerance ran so high. And it's worth remembering that there are still plenty of parts of the world in which religious extremism continues. Religious and moral tolerance is still a pretty new idea in most of the world. One way through which it's pursued is by separating the church from the state. This ensures that no religious morality is able to dominate the nation. I met up with political philosopher and practicing Catholic, Tony Cody. He told me more about the history of this idea.
People sometimes think that the separation of church and state is fueled by anti-religious attitudes, and sometimes it is, but not always. People began to be agitated about how you could be a religious believer in a society when the authorities in that society were running the whole show in accord with some other religious group. So from the religious point of view, it began to seem a strange thing that you could have a Catholic state or a Protestant state, though you did have those sorts of things in the wake of the Reformation for some time. And gradually, I think the idea emerged that it would be a sort of affront to people that they should have the power of the state controlled by a religion or a church. And gradually, of course, what became associated with this was a strong emphasis on the idea of freedom of conscience. Now, there'd been something of this in religions in the past, but it certainly wasn't a dominant idea. And really, it's an idea that philosophically is very much in the mix when you talk about the separation of church and state.
We're still developing our ideas about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. In the modern world, we value the separation of church and state. And we see religious and secular ethics as keeping out of each other's way. What happens in our secular parliament doesn't take its lead from what happens in the church or the mosque or the temple. But are the secular and the sacred really as separate as we think?
It's often made out as though if you have a religious position on something, that'll be hermetically sealed, and the other people will have their secular reasons, that'll be hermetically sealed, and you won't get any interplay between them. But this is just not true. Also, I think that the idea of secular reason and religious reason ignores the fact that religion has permeated the secular culture in the past, and secular thought has permeated religious culture in the past, so that things that are said to be religious reasons now or secular reasons now are often imbued with things from the other side. And I think that the big opposition here doesn't make a lot of sense.
OK, so we can allow a diversity of religious moralities to exist so long as the secular laws still get obeyed. But, as Tony Cody said, many of our secular laws are underpinned by a Christian morality which has endured over the centuries. Just think about the laws restricting who can get married. These laws can be difficult to change, even when community values shift. In India, the tradition is quite different. They encourage ongoing debate about all aspects of religious ethics. Everything is considered up for grabs. Nothing is regarded as having been written in stone.
Hinduism is an umbrella term for, many different schools, many different philosophical traditions, many different religious traditions. Some of them have no place for God. Others do have a place for God. So it was always, diversity was taken as a fact. That's the given. That's where you begin. I think what's important here is, not to take any of the doctrines for granted. These doctrines have to be engaged with critically, Arguments have to be presented and, let the best argument win. It's not a matter of, this is the word of God and this we can't question. So there's nothing like that in Hinduism or in the Buddhist scriptures that no one, says, this is beyond question. There is nothing like that. And that gives you real understanding, real insight, because through disagreement and through trying to work through the disagreements, or at least working through the reasons why, we have certain beliefs that we do, that, gives you a better understanding. And I think, understanding is much more important than anything else for, an inclusive society.
So to get diversity to work for us, we need to work hard to understand the content of other people's moral views and to engage respectfully with those views. Trouble is, humans are highly prone to stereotype members of other groups. I want you to imagine a Chinese man or a Muslim woman. You probably just used a stereotype. Now, stereotyping is impossible to avoid in today's complicated world. We're never going to completely outsmart stereotypes, but what we can do is prevent them from calling all the shots when it comes to interacting with other people. Bronwyn Finnegan works on Buddhist philosophy, and she's interested in the kind of effects that stereotyping can have.
It's all very well to say we have stereotypes, but the question is, well, what do you do about it? Because the way stereotypes function is they happen before you choose. Your behaviour is driven through the world like that. And it can't be the case that we should slow everything so much down that we second-guess everything. I mean, neuroscience tells us that one of the great things about our brains is that we find shortcuts. That's one of the advantages humans have. Concepts, categories, stereotypes can be very helpful. I think we're all really aware of stereotypes and implicit bias these days, but I don't think it features enough in moral discourse. And it reminds me of a metaphor that Iris Murdoch once introduced as a sort of a complaint about moral philosophy. She says, we treat it a bit like going into a shop. You step into the shop and there's all the products sort of arranged in front of you, and the only task for you is to choose the right thing. We often ignore the fact that the shelves are stacked. Externally, products are placed at eye level with bright packaging, with little signs on it saying, buy me. So you're drawn by certain things. It's not just neutrally all there and you just have to choose one or the other. You're being pulled in certain ways. And then there's these internal factors, your interests, your mood at the time, your openness to be prepared to look at other things. I think that's a really powerful thought, and it's the thought that really drives my research a lot. And Buddhism, sort of this talk about cultivating virtues and mindfulness and attentiveness, these kind of metaphors sort of speak to this, because quite often we get, here's our plan. I'm going to do this and this and this today, and I'm just going to, navigate around all these obstacles, and here's just another obstacle, and I can check my phone and I have to go home for dinner. Sort of allow ourselves to be just sensitive enough that if something is sort of knocking you off kilter, to allow yourself to be knocked off.
One concern we might have about religious diversity is that it risks leading to a kind of social segregation. This might happen when members of a particular religion all attend the same place of worship, all attend the same school, and people generally stick to their own group. This prevents the right kind of mutual understanding between members of different groups. I asked Tony Cody what he thought about this problem.
If you take the idea of Catholic schools, there is the problem that it might produce too much isolation, as might Islamic schools and so on. That is a problem that ought to be faced in these circumstances. But there's also the positive benefit in it. People brought up with these different religious outlooks, in this case, gives them a different slant on things, so they don't get sucked into a sort of conformist thing. The existence of Catholic schools in the past, when they were a bit too isolated, in my view, nonetheless had the benefit that they didn't buy the British Empire in the way that the rest of Australia did, right up, into the 1940s, where rah-rah empire was all over the place. Well, the Catholic schools brought that a bit too, but not entirely, partly because they had an Irish background, but that seems to me to have been a beneficial thing, to have had that distance from the central cultural myths and ideas.
The ability to question the world can also be applied to your religion. One of the marks of a moderate, as opposed to a fundamentalist, is that they're willing to question their own cultural and moral traditions.
I'm going to take, the Indian tradition as an example. If the group of Hindus says that, female infanticide is part of my belief, boys are more precious. And if you think I'm going to sit there and say, no, this is your belief, so I'm not going to question it, I don't think that's fair. I think, we have a right to question, and we should never give up that independent standpoint and all cultures, all religions should be equally subject to that critical. And I think that's where philosophy has a role to play. Philosophy can give you the resources to, have that kind of attitude so that you can engage critically without being disrespectful.
Living in a multicultural society with a diversity of religious outlooks is a fact of 21st century life. We oppose governments banning religions or differentiating among people according to their religious code. But what happens when this liberal system comes up against a nation of people who reject diversity and want to make everyone else the same as them? Now, the best answers are going to come from respectful dialogue between religions and by encouraging debate within a religion. The really important thing is to recognise that diversity isn't just something to be tolerated, like an itch or a bad smell. Instead, it's something that can benefit society. Embracing the way in which we're different from each other can help us question the values that otherwise we just take for granted. And the resulting dialogue, done properly, advances social justice. What do you think? Next time, can we control our borders?